Well, something that INFJs don't really do, um, and this might be a bit off-putting to some people, this might be liked by other people, is that they don't really ask personal questions. Now, of course, they can ask you a question which is directed at you. But it will always be formulated by means of generalities, right? It's only when they get to know someone at a very intimate level, which is usually few people, that INFJs really get to that personal level where they ask questions that are completely aligned, not with a generality that the other party, that the interlocutor can answer in their name, but what is communicated remains a generality. You know, what do you think of this particular domain of art or this particular domain of science? Asking questions, or like, what is your stance on relationships? That's very different. Asking what is your stance on relationships, that's very different from saying, so how is your relationship going, right? And that kind of question, the latter one, is something that an INFJ will rarely ever ask you unless they're on very intimate terms. Now, you might argue that for this particular question that I mentioned there, that will apply to most forms of friendships and relationships. It's a personal question, so if you don't know the person very well, you will not ask that question. But there are lots of other questions that maybe are not quite as intimate as personal, that are still directed at the subjectivity of the other person. And as a rule, unless you're on very close terms with an INFJ, they are rarely in situations where they will ask you that question. And conversely, they will tend to be a little put off, a little nonplussed, if you were to ask them a very personal question. They are likely to answer it. They will answer it. They're courteous. They're diplomatic most of the time. They're FE users. But they will answer it in a way which is general. Again, they will answer in generalities. That's the interesting, it's an interesting twist on this idea that INFJs are very mysterious or very private people. They are private and they are mysterious insofar as they often answer your questions in ways that are perfectly acceptable and polite, but they will never or rarely ever answer your question in a way that completely satisfies the questioner's need for a particular part of the INFJ's life to be unveiled. Usually they answer the question, that is to say, the INFJ answers the question in a way that fulfills the answer's role of meeting the questioner's demands at one level, and yet without uncovering that part of their intimate life, which they might otherwise have done if they had answered the question differently. And again, this might be true not just of INFJs, but there are certainly many types for whom personal questions that are answered on personal terms and not on general terms are the norm. It's just not something that happens that often with INFJs. And by the way, if you are one of these people who wonders about whether you're an INFP or an INFJ, or if someone you know it as an INFP or an INFJ, that's one useful way, and that applies to ENFP as well. It's one useful way to think about it. ENFPs and INFPs, similarly for ISFPs and ESFPs, they question personal and they answer personal. They don't question through a general scheme or answer through a general scheme, which again could lead to some wires being crossed and some misunderstanding arising between the types. But again, if that's one thing that you're wondering about INFJ versus INFP, think about this general versus the idiosyncratic and the peculiar. Where do you place the priority, or where does the person whose type you're wondering about place the priority? So that's one thing that INFJs don't do, is ask very personal question, very particular question. They usually go for the general, both in questioning and in answering. It's not necessarily super deliberate. It's just, I think, how their brain is wired. That's what they do with their cognitive function stack. If you want to know more about the particular ways that INFJs are in the world, you know that you can get The Infinite Soul, which is my new book. It's right there. It's beautiful. It's getting good reviews, so check it out at the links below. On INFJs leading a meaningful, purposeful, and rich life in the world today. The Infinite Soul. It happens to be the sequel to a book that you know about, which is The Ecstatic Soul. That's more an analysis of the INFJ psyche. And you can check the reviews at the link below for The Ecstatic Soul. It's a widely reviewed and widely read book. If you haven't got a copy, it's an authoritative book on the INFJ psychology. Okay? And don't forget, there's a Patreon page. Recently, I've gotten some new subscribers. Thank you so much, because it really helps me with keeping the channel going. I appreciate you so much. And please consider joining my Patreon. The link is also below. Okay, see you tomorrow, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.